Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Moodle Academy webinar on creating effective intended learning outcomes. I'm Anna Karsa, Education and Qualification Coordinator in the Moodle Academy team, and today I'm joined by Karen Shackleford-Cesare from University College London, who will be presenting the session. Thank you so much, Karen, for being here with us today.
You're welcome.
And the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Well, I don't know what time
Please.
it is in the part of the world that you're joining this session from, but good day, and I'm glad you could make it. And I hope that you find this a useful session to be participating in. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll kick off. So, with regards to asking questions, as Hannah said, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. You don't need to save your question to the very end. You can put your questions in the chat or raise your hand as soon as you have a question. And please do join the Menti. You can use your mobile phone if you've got that with you, or you can use another window on your browser in your laptop and just go to menti.com and use the access code, or the next slide will have a QR code if you're using a mobile or tablet, and you can just scan the code. So what we'll do is first off look at definitions for the terms learning aims, objectives, and outcomes. Then we'll have a brief look at where the whole idea of learning outcomes comes from, namely the educational strategy known as constructive alignment. And then we'll have a look at why learning outcomes are important, what the characteristics of them are, how you can assess using them, how you actually craft a learning outcome, how you write one, how you construct it. Aspects of a learning outcome involve active verbs, which ones to choose, when, and why. What about things that might be hard to assess? How do you deal with those? And then we have some examples of learning outcomes, and then you'll have a chance to draft your own, and I will provide some feedback on those that are posted, possibly not all of them, but at least a few. And then some ideas on how you can use out learning outcomes going forward once you've taken the time to craft them, what you might wish to do next, and of course there'll be references. All of these slides will be available to you in Moodle following this session. So don't worry about taking copious notes. That's probably unnecessary. And if you miss anything, you can go back to it in the PowerPoint slide deck on Moodle. And I think also once you join the Menti, you can revise the slides once I've completed going through the deck. So without further ado, let us carry on. So this is a QR code that you can scan now if you wish. Or you can go to menti.com, as I said before, and that line at the top of the screen, join menti.com, will be on all the slides throughout. So if you lose it, you can, find your way back there, not to worry. But you definitely will have more fun if you join Menti. So we're going to start right off the bat with a Menti question. So what I'd like you to do is to select those statements, and there may be more than one, that best to your mind defines the term learning objectives. This is not really to don't worry about being right or wrong, but just what you understand by the term learning objective. Choose the statements that best match that. Okay, well, I'll stop there and I'll show you the answers. So here you can see that the best descriptors of learning objectives and learning outcomes are A and F. So Going on to the next question. So it's the same statement, so it shouldn't take you as long to read them, but you may want to revise them. Which of these statements best define, to your mind, learning outcomes? And again, it may be more than one. Okay, well, I'll call time here and I'll show you the best definitions in this set for learning outcomes. So if these don't match what you thought they would, let me provide you with some explanation. So in some of the literature that you will encounter in sort of educational forums, they don't make a distinction between learning outcomes and learning objectives, and the two terms are used interchangeably. So some of you may have been a bit puzzled as to why there were different definitions here proposed for objectives from outcomes. Well, at UCL, we've decided to go with the literature that makes a clear distinction between learning objectives and learning outcomes, because then we think it can be more useful for tutors and students to understand that learning outcomes are from the perspective of the student, in that they state what the student will be able to do as a consequence of what they've learned on a unit of learning. Whereas an objective, a learning objective, is more about the tutor's perspective, what the tutor intends to teach. So it could include everything that the tutor intends to impart, but it doesn't necessarily relate to what the student will be able to do as a consequence of what they've been taught and what they've learned from that teaching. So aims, A and E and G, are overarching statements about what the whole learning journey will entail. Objectives, what the tutor plans to teach, outcomes, what the student will be able to do. And that's it in a nutshell. So now I'm going to sort of show you a video that I found on YouTube, which has a nice kind of discussion about what constructive alignment is. And we're going to talk, we like to put into the frame the idea of constructive alignment, because that's really the basis under which learning outcomes make sense. So if you have problems hearing it, please say something in the chat.
Model of education. Students went to school, were taught material, and then were tested by demonstrating they had memorized what had been taught. It was a very teacher-centered system designed for the industrial age. Times have changed, jobs have changed, and so have the skill sets required after graduation. It's what students can do with what they learned in school is highly valued. Teachers don't just teach concepts, they facilitate learning experiences and co-construct learning with their learners. So what do learners think is important? Assessments. All through high school, they've been conditioned to pass the exam, and they've learned to be strategic. Most learners will do what they need to do to pass the course. And often, that's all they'll do. Period. To illustrate this, let's look at one example. The lecturer wants his learners to be able to think critically about his subject, but tests them with a multiple choice exam that only requires them to memorize definitions. Guess what students will do? They'll memorize definitions, and they'll pass. Will they be able to think critically to the lecturer's satisfaction? Maybe, maybe not. It probably won't matter to the learners, because they won't need to be good critical thinkers to pass the test. But despite the celebrations, it's a short-term victory, for they may not be acquiring the 21st century skills they need. The problem is that this lecturer's assessment task is not aligned to the desired outcomes from the students. So what do we do to get students practicing the skills we want them to have? We decide the outcomes we want, create tasks to build towards those outcomes, then test students with assessments that have been designed based on those outcomes. That's constructive alignment. It's all about outcomes, assessment tasks, and learning activities being aligned. We'll discuss this in more detail in the next section.
Great. And before we discuss this in the next section, hope you are paying attention because now you have a quiz. If you were to develop a course applying the principles of constructive alignment, what would you do first? Decide what content to cover, plan a reading list, identify what students should be able to do when they've completed the course, design assessments students will be asked to do, devise the activities and tasks that will facilitate learning. Choose. There's one answer that's correct. Great. So 15 of you were right. Very good. So let's see how we're doing on the leaderboard. Fantastic. So question 2. Get ready, set, and go. What would you do next if you were developing a course and applying the principles of constructive alignment? One answer is correct. It's the same answers, so I won't read them again, but you choose. Great. Okay, so 3 of you were on target. And the leaderboard again. Brilliant. So next question. This question, what's the third task you would do if you were going to develop a course using constructive alignment? And it's the same responses. Should be getting easier because they're narrowing down. Fantastic. So 8 people were on the button. Final slide. What's the fourth task you would do? Decide what content to cover, plan a reading or resource list, identify what a student would be able to do when they've completed the course, design assessments, design activities. Right. Okay. Great. So, so this is to just confirm what some of you had already gathered, that you do start with the idea of constructive alignment is that you start with what it is you want students to be able to do and know by the end of the course. Once you've decided what it is they need to be able to do, then you come up with the kind of assessment that will enable you to test or convince you that they have in fact achieved the outcome, that they can do what you are designing the course to enable them to do. And then once you've designed your assessment, you build around it activities that will prepare students to do the assessment. And then once you've got your activities, then you can plan, you can see what content is needed to facilitate the activities, which in turn facilitate the assessment, which in turn ensure students are able to achieve the learning outcomes. So that's the idea. So hence, we can start to see why learning outcomes are important. Effective learning outcomes can help to define and realize the vision and identity of a short course or a collection. And a collection in this context is if you're designing a number of courses where one course builds on the other, so the courses are interrelated. You can't really do the last one without having done the ones before. So the first course might be a prerequisite for the second course and so on. So you might have what I would call in this instance a collection of short courses or MOOCs or whatever you're developing. And the outcomes also help you to communicate the collection or the vision or purpose of the course or set of related courses to your tutors if you're co-teaching on any of your courses. It also obviously communicates to students what they can expect to achieve at a minimum. So this is not what the high achievers can achieve. This is what all students who pass should be able to achieve. That's what it represents, the core criteria that will be used to assess them. And it helps you to ensure that all your activities and assessments that you provide students with are aligned with the learning outcomes and are designed specifically to ensure that they can do the things you want them to be able to do at the end. And they inform students of the criteria that they're going to need to be able to address. They help the tutors or the assessors structure feedback on assessments, how close or far they are in demonstrating their ability to do the outcome. And it also can help students and tutors evaluate the effectiveness of courses. So they're highly recommended. And the questions that learning outcomes address, and these are questions that students would likely have, and also tutors who haven't necessarily been involved perhaps with the design of courses, but are expected to teach on them. The questions would be, what should a successful student be able to do with the knowledge that they've acquired on your course? What sort of way will they be able to demonstrate that they've acquired these capabilities by the end? And how well does your course prepare students for the things they may want to do next? And what evidence might you be able to collect to demonstrate that students are progressing in terms of their knowledge and abilities as they advance through your course? So learning outcomes, in effect, address these questions. So based on that little introduction to why learning outcomes or intended learning outcomes are important, here's another quiz question for you to tackle. And all you need to do is to select all the statements that you think represent characteristics of effective intended learning outcomes. Okay, well, if there are no more contributors, I will reveal the answers now. Okay, so there are only two things here that are not characteristics of an intended learning outcome. So the first one, learning outcomes aren't focused on what tutors will teach or cover. That's what a learning objective would do. And you wouldn't want as many as 30 learning outcomes for a short course. You'd want to keep it to probably around 3 to 6 typically on a short course. So everything else is a characteristic of a learning outcome, as we'll see here on this slide. So I've put the characteristics of a collection, where a collection, as I said previously, represents an interrelated set of short courses in this kind of reddish-orange color. And the characteristics that apply to both the learning outcomes of collections and short courses, those distinct units, are in purple. And the only one that would apply potentially to a short course alone would be the one in the sky blue. So the idea of learning outcomes, as we have seen, is that they be aligned. So if you have a short course that is part of a collection of short courses, then you would want the learning outcomes of a particular short course in that collection to be aligned with the learning outcomes of the collection overall. So that's the idea that we have here. Once again, outcomes always describe what students can be expected to do based on what they've learned. If it's for a collection, then it's framed in terms of the collection, or another term often used for collections within schools and academia is the word program. Not individual short courses. They're always observable or measurable, i.e. accessible. They're important and inclusive, so they're what all students on the cohort will be expected to be able to do at the end, not just some students, and hence they're the most critical stuff that students are expected to achieve. As I said before, they're aligned. They rely on verbs that specify definite, observable, accessible behaviours. They focus on the core abilities of the subject matter, and they're written in a way that allows the evidence of the outcome's attainment to be captured via a variety of evaluation methods. So that means that you can assess them in more than one way. So you might be able to assess them by having students do a multiple choice quiz, or you might be able to assess them by asking students to write a blog post or something like that. So the outcome is not tied to a specific type of assessment. It's helpful if you're working with other tutors to do it collaboratively. And for a short course, it should be relatively few, 3 to 6. But if you have a collection, then you might have more because it's a collection. So the relationship between the learning outcomes on a short course vis-a-vis those within a collection of interrelated short courses. So the big circle that you see on this screen represents the learning outcomes for a collection at the collection level. And the interrelated courses, course 1, 2, 3, and 4, would each have their own learning outcomes, and those learning outcomes would be aligned with those of the collection for which they form a part. Now, a student may be doing a number of other courses that aren't really part of the collection. They might be optional courses that they choose to do. And some of those outcomes of those courses may also align with those of the collection. But there may be courses that are completely unrelated to the collection, fall outside the collection, and their learning outcomes would not be expected to align with those of the collection. So that's what this represents. Another characteristic of ILOs is that they should independently be smart. That is, explicit enough for students to know exactly what they need to do, and for staff to be able to determine whether or not students have indeed done it in their assessments. And the outcomes must be doable within the time that students have to learn the subject and be pertinent to the aims of the course. So get ready, turn on your Menti. It's time for another quiz. So as learning outcomes should also be characteristically smart, what do you think the S in this acronym stands for? Fantastic. Many of you right on. Next question. 20 players ready? Let's get going. Following on from that question, what do you think the M in this acronym stands for? Is it measurable, methodical, minimal, major, manageable? Great. Everybody got that right. Oh, more or less. So what do you think the A in this acronym stands for? Additional, agreed, accessible, achievable. Yay, achievable. That was kind of a trick question. Accessible was actually covered in measurable. So you're not entirely wrong, but each letter has to represent a different idea. So Elsa comes through on this one. And now what do you think the R stands for? Rigorous, relevant, robust, realistic, routine. Great. So this one had two right answers, relevant and realistic. So last but by no means least, what do you think the T in this acronym stands for? Tolerant, tidy, teachable, tightly structured, time limited. And time limited it is. So the final leaderboard. And Elsa is a champion with the highest number of points. Well done, Elsa. Next slide. So here we have it in a nutshell. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, meaning that it can be done, that you don't set them an assessment that or set a learning outcome that's not achievable in the time that students have to study the subject with you. And hence it's both realistic and relevant to the aims of the overall course, or if it's part of a collection, and the assessment is time limited, or the outcome is time limited, because they don't have forever to do it. So now we come to the thinking about how you might assess with learning outcomes, as in how do you actually use your learning outcomes to make sure that your assessments provide you as a tutor or as an assessor with information that makes you confidently believe that your students have indeed achieved the learning outcome and will be able to do the things that you've designed your learning to facilitate their ability to do. So here I've taken the example of someone who's seeking to gain their pilot's license. The person designing the course or the training for this is going to have in mind three prominent main core learning outcomes, as in this person, any person who wants to get a pilot's license, at a minimum, has to be able to perform a safe takeoff, navigate to fly from A to B, and perform a safe landing. So the learning objectives, as in what they're going to be taught by their tutors, they'll be taught things like the principles of flight, operational procedures, and elements of all of these things to be taught will obviously facilitate them achieving the outcome of being able to perform a safe takeoff, because to perform a safe takeoff, you have to be communicating with air traffic control. You have to be understanding the weather and how that will impact your decisions and so on. When you're going to navigate, you need to know navigation, you need to know air law, where can you be, where can't you be, you need to know how your plane functions and so on. And you can see how each of these area topics that you're going to teach also help students achieve the outcomes. So in their final practical flight exam, the marking criteria that have the most weighting will obviously be that the student can perform a safe takeoff in commonly occurring conditions. So you might not be expecting them to do a takeoff in hurricane conditions, but you would be able to expect them to be able to do a takeoff in mild rain or a sunny day. Similarly, you would expect them to navigate safely and efficiently to fly from A to B, and then at the end to perform a safe landing, once more in commonly concurring conditions. Your better students may be able to take off in very turbulent conditions like heavy snow. You might have students who are able to land on water, literally. You might be able to have students who can fly using less fuel because they, work out where the winds are and make the best use of the environment in which the plane is moving. So you'll have students who kind of present themselves as being above average, but any student who gets a flight license is going to be able to do these three things. So that's kind of gives you a sense of how you would have your learning outcomes, design your assessment to convince you, the assessor, that the student has achieved the outcomes. So now we move to how you actually are going to construct your learning outcomes. So there are three parts. First, you select an action verb that defines what it is you're going to ask your students to do. Then you have in mind a description of the knowledge or skill that they're going to be demonstrating. And then you want to provide them with something that gives them an indication as to what the performance standard would be or the expected level or quality of achievement. So there are two examples on this slide. The active verbs that have been selected in this case of an outcome for a computer science program is that the student produces and debugs. The type of learning that they're going to demonstrate is program source code, and they're going to be able to program in at least two programming languages. So that's the standard for acceptable performance. They need to be able to program source code in at least two programming languages. And there's an example given of C++ and Java. So that type of programming language. So the second example is taken from perhaps an environmental course or a geography course. And the active verb here is that the student will be able to analyze global and environmental factors. Those are the things that they will have learned about in terms of their effects on people. So that's a context in which they'll be able to analyze this information. So there you have the kind of building blocks of how you put together a learning outcome. So another aspect of a learning outcome is when you're selecting your verbs, your active verbs, this can be a useful reference point, Bloom's taxonomy. So what you have here in essence is a pyramid that kind of represents cognitive effort, starting at the bottom with the easiest things to do mentally to the hardest things to do mentally. So remembering something is kind of a base kind of cognitive thing that we all do every day. You try to remember your grocery list and so on. Then understanding might be seen as the next level. Once you understand something, you're able to explain it to others. Then the next level that requires more cognitive effort would be to apply your knowledge to achieve some other end. And then analyzing could be seen as a higher cognitive effort further, where you're trying to break the material into constituent parts and see how they relate to each other and so on. And then evaluating, another step up, and then creating kind of finally might be the most cognitively demanding thing to do. The idea is that if you have a collection of interrelated courses, where, as I said, one might build on the other, the earlier ones being prerequisites for the later ones, then you might want to use verbs that represent this progression. And you might even do that in a single course where students are moving from one topic in the course to a next topic and so on. So here are some active verbs, and Richard is going to put them in the chat. If you've got your Moodle course for this open, you'll also find a list of list of active verbs there. There are 5 tables, but in my slide deck, I've only picked out 2. But you're going to be using them shortly because I'm going to be inviting you to try and draft some learning outcomes yourself. So here are some active verbs that you might use for the metacognitive domain. And the sort of area, the levels of cognitive effort are kind of at the top row: specify, contextualize, conceptualize, blah, blah. And then a definition of kind of roughly what's meant by each of those words. And then hence you'd be able to see why these verbs are deemed as potential things you might want to use if you have that sort of outcome in mind. So some of the things to avoid. So you want to avoid words and terms that are vague or ambiguous or difficult to measure. So words like appreciate or understand, they're very good for objectives because you may want to try and impart to students an understanding of something. You may want them to be able to appreciate great art and things like that. But you can't actually know if they appreciate great art or if they understand something if you can't read their minds. The only way you can actually know is if they present you with something tangible that shows that they know or appreciate or understand. So as I said before, if you understand something, that generally means that you're able to explain it. So your active verb in that case, instead of understand, you want to use a word like explain, describe, define, and so on. If you want to find a verb to describe a behavior, are they able to create? Can they apply? Will they be able to hypothesize? That's the sort of active verb that you would use instead of these more kind of wishy-washy words and phrases. These are good for objectives. They're not good for outcomes. So as I was saying before, you might want to have a progression of outcomes. So here in course 1 or unit 1 of a particular course, by the end of that unit or course, students will be able to list, and in this case I've used the example of a medical example, list the symptoms and combinations that may be due to some sort of cancerous mass. In course 2 or unit 2 of the same course, by the end of that, they're actually able to explain the effects of cancerous masses and thus the appropriate test to conduct. By the end of Unit 3 or Course 3, they can go on to diagnose cancerous mass and prescribe an appropriate management regime for the patient. So on the successful completion of a collection of these courses or units of learning, students are able to prescribe appropriate management for cancerous mass in soft tissue of the human body. So you can see how they kind of build to help the student achieve the final outcome of the collection. So what about hard to assess outcomes in quotes? So for example, on the successful completion of a course, students will be able to appreciate the intangible benefits of art in society, question their own beliefs and recognize personal bias, understand the value of ethics in business leadership. Now, this is indeed what you are hoping students may gain from the course you've designed, but you can't necessarily know that they have achieved it. So these are things that I would say categorize better as learning objectives. You should definitely share them with your students and let them know that these are the things that you're hoping this course will help them to achieve. But you're not going to assess these things because they're very hard to assess. So you wouldn't make them into learning outcomes necessarily. Now, for those of you who already have a course that you've already designed, but you don't have any learning outcomes for it, you can kind of work backwards if you've got some sort of a way of assessing your students then you can look at the assessment criteria or the marking criteria for those assessments. And whatever it is that you're giving the highest weighting is probably the nugget that you can use to form a learning outcome that's SMART, as described previously. So that's a tip. Now, to make a SMART learning outcome, you remember it's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant, and it's time limited. And it has 3 parts: the active verb, it has what the learning is, and then it has a performance level that they're expected to achieve. So here we have one learning outcome, and we have a beginning statement. On the successful completion of this program or course, students will be able to have knowledge of hypothetical engineering principles. Well, this is kind of weak because it's not terribly specific, as in it doesn't specify the engineering principles a graduate would be able to, should know. And it doesn't define what is meant by have knowledge. Because does that mean that they're simply able to define the principles, which is a lower cognitive level of effort? Or should they actually be able to apply the principles, which is a higher level of cognitive ability? So let's see if the person who devised this outcome can improve on it. So they have another bash. On the successful completion of this course, students will be competent in the principles of engineering design, formulating requirements and constraints and following an open-ended decision process involving trade-offs. Well, that certainly sounds a lot more specific. And it is better for this reason. However, it's still vague in some respects in that it doesn't really hone in on the level of competency that a student should achieve. How are they going to be able to demonstrate their competence? So the final goal that the tutor had was to say, on the successful completion of this course, students will be able to apply the principles of engineering design, formulating requirements and constraints following open-ended decision processes involving trade-offs to complete designs that address a hypothetical engineering need. So that's the final piece. It's better because it's specific about the requirements and the level and scope of competence to be attained is also stated. So that's kind of what you're driving for. So that's why this course is referred to as crafting learning outcomes, because it's an iterative process. The first thing you write down is probably not going to be, the best thing that ever since sliced bread of learning outcomes. It's going to take some thought and some rejigging and, be patient. You'll get there. So for some additional examples, here are today's learning outcomes. So you should now be able to explain what constructive alignment is and how it can be implemented in a unit of learning or interrelated units of learning. You should now be able to describe the difference between learning outcomes, objectives, and learning aims. And you should also be able to formulate SMART learning outcomes at these various levels. And to test that you can, in fact, do those things, here's your last activity for this workshop. So what I want you to do now is to think about a key concept or topic in a course that you're either planning to teach, proposing to design, or are currently teaching, and then try and draft a SMART intended learning outcome for that concept that you have in mind or topic. And this SMART outcome should express how students can show you their grasp of the topic or concept. While you're doing this, you might want to think about how you would assess this, and then On the following screen, I want you to type in your draft ILOs, and then I can give you some feedback on it. Don't be shy. It's not expected to be perfect the first time around. Just kind of give it a first go. I might ask if the person who puts it on the board for sharing wants to say a bit about what they teach, or you might want to put it in the chat or something. If you're shy, not to worry, and then we'll see how we get on. So Richard is going to copy these instructions into the chat so you can look back at them, because I know how it is. You often kind of forget what it was you were asked to do by the tutor at this stage. So the instructions will be in the chat, and then you can type them into the Menti. Or if you've lost the Menti, you can also type your drafts into the chat if that makes it easier for you, whichever. So I'll leave this screen up for a couple of minutes until I see the instructions in the chat at least. Note that for this exercise, you will also need to refer to the taxonomy of outcomes, educational outcomes, active verbs, compilation. And Richard has put a link to that in the chat. So when you're drafting, you can click on that link, open that document, and there's ample verbs for you to choose from for pretty much any intended learning outcome you might want to compose.
Yep. Just confirming that we have both a PDF with the taxonomies and with the active verbs, and also the guidelines for the task.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. So this information is now in the chat. So I'll just present the screen where your draft learning outcomes will appear for discussion and feedback if you choose to post them there. So you have, all in all, probably around, how are we doing for time? Probably around 10 minutes left for this task, 10 to 12 minutes.
Yes, that will be fine.
And if you have any questions for me, you can also use this time to ask them. If you're a bit hesitant about what to do, you might also want to look back at the formula slide. I don't know if Rich or Hannah, you can put the formula slide in the chat or the text from that slide. So to remind everyone kind of what component parts make up an intended learning outcome.
Karen, just while we're waiting on everyone to put their responses in, there was just one question in the chat, and I'm assuming I've understood it after misunderstanding it initially. It's a question about, is there a list of active verbs that are especially useful for describing tasks or activities in online courses, so specifically in online courses? I'm not sure if you want to talk to that. Maybe they all apply equally, but just whether you could respond to that one.
Yes, I'd say that they could all apply equally. I don't think the outcomes for online courses are necessarily any different from the outcomes for what you might refer to as in-person courses. So, for example, if you have an online course on needlework, it might have videos and what have you, and for students to watch. and they might be encouraged to put videos up of what they're trying to do or something. But the outcome might be that they should be able to do certain stitches and understand or appreciate and sort of be able to do certain stitches in particular ways on certain types of material, say. And that would still be the same outcome if it was in person and students were rocking up to class with their samples in their hand, and the tutor could demonstrate on a physical piece of material in real time that students could touch the same different ways of making a given stitch. So I would say that by and large, your online outcomes and your in-person outcomes would be the same, and so the verbs would be the same. Okay, well, I'll start giving feedback. Hopefully I won't sort of break the concentration of others who are still sort of trying to think of something. But just to say that the third one in the first row, describe and illustrate the key differences between Carolati, I'm afraid I can't pronounce that, and Euro, whatever type, between two different types of cell anyway. Seems like a very good learning outcome. There are different ways in which you could assess that. You could it could be in the form of an essay, it could be in the form of an exam, it could be in the form of making a model. So you're not kind of restricting students in the ways that they can demonstrate their abilities in this way. And so it's smart. And that seems like it would do the job. And then the second one on the first row, identify greenwashing by referring to 6 criteria of the greenwashing hydra. And they've proposed that they might assess this by asking students to present several detailed examples. Oh, no, sorry. By presenting students with several detailed examples and then asking them to identify those using greenwashing and to say why they think they're using greenwashing in those cases. That's clear enough. Yep, that's a good one too. And then the first one, there's 2 learning outcomes. List the tool or tools used to add a new page to in an Excel app. Straightforward. And then master a method to perform adding a new page in an Excel app. Master a method to perform adding a new page in the Excel app. Yeah. I think the second one here, master a method. I'm not sure that you need that. I think it sounds a bit like an objective because you want to teach them methods to perform adding a new page, but you might not actually need those first 3 words. The outcome might just be on the successful completion of this course, students will be able to add a new page in an Excel app. So add a new page might be sufficient. You could sort of say add a new page via a variety of routes in Excel app, if that makes sense. So then moving now to the second row, a course on assessment methods and tools in Moodle. Good to know. By the end of this course, learners will be able to detect from a list of Moodle tools the ones that support assessment. That's fine. Yep. You could also use the word identify. And that certainly can be assessed easily by a quiz question. And then I suppose there could be more challenging outcomes as well. As list to do with how they might apply tools in Moodle to conduct assessment. That might be useful. And then staying with the second row again, moving across. So we've got the person who contributed this has said that the environment is a webinar for learning about new features in Moodle. So the intended learning outcome they've proposed is at the level of remembering. So the student will be able to list and summarize the main new features of this version of Moodle. That's certainly, yeah, that can't go wrong with that. List and summarize the main new features of Moodle. It's interesting here, though, the use of the word summarize. It's one thing in a way to list. There may be 5 new features, so they list them. And when you say summarize, are you asking them to summarize what they do, or is it that the features are very detailed, so you want them to be able to summarize the essence of what the function of the new features? So I think I would, for the benefit of the students, I think you might be able to perhaps skip the word list and just ask them to summarize the main new features of this version of Moodle. List may oddly sort of complicate things, because if they can summarize the main new features, then they're in fact listing them. So the list might be a redundant term you could do without. You do want to try and have a simple statement, but at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily say it has to be a short statement. You just need it to convey clearly what it is students should be able to do. And that can be a longer statement. It can be actually 1 or 2 sentences. But try and kind of reduce it to its simplest wording, so students don't kind of get into a bit of a knot trying to pick out, well, if I do this, but what, yeah. So moving on to the next one in the second row, analyze and interpret experimental data using RStudio. You might want to make it a little more specific in terms of the nature of the experimental data. Is it experimental data that appears in any form for any subject area? So I'm not sure sort of like how general the course you have in mind is, but I think you might want to make the context of experimental data a bit more specific. I'm not saying that you have to, because I don't actually know what it is your course is about, and it may be perfect for the context of your course. But just from an outsider view, I'm just thinking that might be helpful. So the one under that, which is part of the third row, although it looks like part of the second, analyzing, evaluating, and understanding road traffic signs. Well, straight off the bat, I would say that you want to kick out the word understanding from this outcome, because you can't read their minds, so you don't actually know what they understand. So just go with So on the successful completion of this course, students will be able to analyze and evaluate road traffic signs. I think you could be perhaps a bit more specific in kind of analyze and evaluate to what purpose? What are they looking for what do you want them to be able to understand from reading road traffic signs? And is it just reading the signs, or kind of from the placement of signs? Does that tell them something? From the number of signs, kind of, I think you might need to add a bit more meat to those bones and definitely strip out understanding. So going on to the first item on the third row, assessment in Moodle course, great. And so objective outcome 1, set up an assignment activity in demo course. 2, create 10 quiz questions following the Aitken format. So here the outcomes are very specific to a task, especially number 2. So what you want to do in an outcome is think about what it is the student will be able to do on the successful completion of the course. So the assessment is still part of the course, and you're assessing to see if the student has achieved the outcome, which means that when the course is behind them, they are able to do these things. So you don't want to tie it to just the fact that they can do the assessment. You want to tie it to things that they can do having done the course. The course is behind them. They're moving on with their lives. What is it they can now do? You would want to say something like they would be able to use Moodle's quiz tool to create quizzes following the Aitken format. And that makes it a bit more general, and that speaks to what they can do at the end of the course. At the end of the course, they can create quizzes following the Aitken format. Whether it's 10 questions or a zillion questions, doesn't matter. And then set up an assignment activity in a demo course. Again, that's reference to a particular task. So you want to kind of reword it slightly so that it refers to what they can do after they've finished that course. But you're on the way, you know what it is you want them to be able to do, how you're going to assess them. But just word it slightly differently to say what they can do beyond the course itself in Moodle. So the last one we have here so far is apply the guidelines given in our style guide to the creation of digital content. That's a good one. But again, I don't know if you want to limit it necessarily to your style guide, but maybe you do, because maybe that is the point of the course that you're teaching. But a more general thing that would refer to kind of what they should be able to do beyond the course is that apply the guidelines given in a style guide, as in pretty much any style guide. It might be a standard style guide to the creation of digital content. And that might make it kind of beyond the particular course. But if it's specific, if you definitely want to keep it very specific to your course and what they need to be able to do at the end of your course for the project, or what they're going to be embarking on, maybe it's fine as it is. Yeah. So that's all that have been submitted so far. Anyone got another one in the wings in the chat that I haven't seen, or anything else? Or does anyone want to ask a question about anything I've said?
Well, from what I can see, we don't have something in the chat. All the exams or all the attempts have been posted here in Menti.
Okay. And I've just scrolled down and I see another one. So this is for a bachelor level consumer behavior course, and students will be able to produce an engaging 15-second commercial that targets attitude change in consumers using frugal equipment, for example, only a smartphone. Funny that smartphones are considered frugal equipment when they have more power than a supercomputer 30 years ago. But yeah, that's just an idle observation on my part. So again, this refers to a specific task, as in it sounds like a description of the assessment rather than an outcome in the sort of purest sense. So produce a 15-second engaging commercial that targets. Maybe be less specific about the 15-second. I don't know if that would make sense in your context. But sort of say something like under 30-second, or no more than 15-second commercial that targets attitude change in consumers using frugal equipment. So when they finish the course, they're going to be able to produce a very short commercial that aimed at changing the attitudes of consumers using relatively frugal equipment such as a smartphone. Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Yeah. I must say that you've all done really well. You've taken on board what we've covered today, and I think you should be fine. Someone says they couldn't listen to all parts of the webinar. Will a recording be available to access later?
Yes, of course. Not right after, because it will go through some editing, but it will be soon uploaded.
And presumably being uploaded to the Moodle course for this web relate.
Yes, right below the link for the webinar.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing anything else come into the chat. We're 3 minutes towards the end of time for this webinar. So as I'm not seeing any questions or hands or anyone wanting to ask a question, and there aren't any more draft ILOs for me to go through, I just want to thank you all for coming and for being such willing participants. and joining in the quizzes with gusto. I hope you gain something from this webinar that you can take away and make good use of. And thank you once again for coming. Thanks also to Hannah and to Anna and to Richard for their stalwart support of this session. And with that, I think I have maybe one or two more slides before I actually say goodbye. So for how you can use your learning outcomes, once you've taken the time and effort, and it is quite a bit of time and effort as you have experienced, do make use of them. Publicize them in all the material that you might have for promoting your courses. If you've got a collection of related courses, also use them to make sure that the courses that form that collection are cohesive, form a cohesive curriculum from the perspective of how students experience them. Make sure you use them to have your activities aligned so you're helping students to achieve the outcomes clearly in a step-by-step and transparent way. And also tell your students about how to interpret the learning outcomes, because just putting them in the course, kind of like the build them and they will come thing doesn't always work, and I don't think it works in the context of learning outcomes. I think you need to explain to students how they should interpret them, which is pretty much how the explanation I gave you of how to write them, and therefore why it is that they're being asked to do activities and assessments. It will help probably with them engaging because things will seem to have a reason. So your next steps, draft away. If possible, maybe discuss them with other students and indeed your prospective or past students or current students. Check for alignment. And you might then want to consider doing an ABC learning design workshop to map your outcomes to your activities and to your assessments. So here the lesson ends and the practice begins. Bon voyage.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. I will just take over so we can wrap up this session. It has been really interesting and engaging. I'm pretty sure everyone enjoyed, and we have learned a lot. So, if you have enjoyed this session, we would love you to consider getting involved further and help us grow by contributing to the development of Moodle Academy. You can do this by visiting our Get Involved course, which you will find on the front page of the Moodle Academy site. And you can suggest ideas for new webinars and courses. And of course, you can vote on the ideas that have been suggested by others. Keep in mind that we are always on the lookout for community members who want to help present webinars and co-create online courses. So feel free to catch up. And we would love also your help making Moodle Academy more inclusive. So if you're able to, please go to our Translate Moodle Academy course and get started with helping us translate our courses and webinars into other languages. Of course, please help spread the word about Moodle Academy by telling your colleagues about the courses we offer and the webinars we run. When you complete a course, you will earn a badge, and educators and administrators might like to think about getting Moodle qualification, Moodle educator qualification, or Moodle administrator qualification. So learn more about these qualifications from the Moodle qualifications blog in the Academy homepage. So, thank you for joining us today. I hope you find this useful, and I hope to see you on the next Moodle Academy course forums and webinars. See you around.